It was still dark enough that the mist hung low over the tree line, the kind of fog that made the world feel smaller, quieter, and safe, until the crunch of tires on gravel snapped me awake and I realized safety had just left the building. I stepped out onto my porch in nothing but flannel pants and a faded t-shirt, coffee mug in hand, and was greeted by the sight of 4 black SUVs idling in a semicircle around my cabin, like they were filming a low-budget action movie. Doors opened in unison, boots hit the ground, and half a dozen men in matching black jackets and ball caps fanned out across my yard with military precision. One of them raised a bullhorn, and in the kind of voice you only hear from mall cops who failed the police exam, declared that the property was under HOA security lockdown. I almost laughed, because the only thing more ridiculous than HOA security was the fact that they'd driven 2 hours into the mountains to pull this stunt. Then I saw the one with mirrored sunglasses signaling toward my front steps, and I set my mug down slowly, because I knew they thought they had me. I walked down the steps, feeling the damp boards creak under my feet, and when I reached the middle of the yard I pulled out a thin black wallet, flipped it open, and let the badge inside catch the pale dawn light. The man with the bullhorn froze mid-sentence. One of the others whispered something into his radio. The air went dead quiet except for the rumble of the SUVs, and I could see in their faces that whatever they thought this morning was going to be, it had just changed entirely. That was the moment I knew the HOA had seriously miscalculated, and if they kept pushing, this was going to end very badly, for them. The silence stretched for another beat before one of the men, clearly in charge, stepped forward and asked in a voice that was trying and failing to sound casual whether we could talk inside. I almost smiled at the idea of letting 6 strangers into my cabin after they'd surrounded it, but I simply gestured toward the picnic table by the shed and told them to have a seat. That seemed to throw them off even more, because these were men who expected confrontation, not hospitality, and certainly not from someone who looked like he had just rolled out of bed. But I had learned a long time ago that you never waste good theater when it comes to defusing or escalating a situation, whichever serves you better. While they shuffled awkwardly toward the table, I noticed a second set of headlights approaching from the far side of my property. This wasn't random. This was coordinated, and that meant the HOA president herself was on her way. I knew I had about 5 minutes before she arrived, which was just enough time to start peeling back why they were here. The lead guy, short haircut, jaw that had been clenched for years, sat opposite me and started on some speech about community safety initiatives. I let him get about 12 words in before I asked if they usually brought tactical teams to check whether someone's trash cans were in compliance. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't bite. Instead, he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was an HOA-issued emergency property safety notice, citing alleged hazards on my land. I scanned it and almost laughed again. They were claiming my firewood stack was a wildlife nesting risk, and my solar panels were improperly installed. Both were absurd, and more importantly, neither fell under their jurisdiction. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. By the time the HOA president's shiny silver crossover rolled up, the air had gone from tense to brittle. She stepped out in a tailored jacket and heels that had no business on mountain gravel, carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her smile was the kind that says she's already won, and she walked straight to me, ignoring the men she had hired. She announced in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear that the board had authorized her to seize my property for noncompliance until remediation measures could be enacted. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Instead, I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit the call button on a number I hadn't used in a while. When the line picked up, I spoke just 2 words. "It's me." The effect was immediate. 3 of the security guys shifted uncomfortably, one of them muttered something about jurisdiction, and the HOA president's smile faltered just enough to tell me she understood this was no longer her stage. What she didn't know was that I'd been expecting this for weeks. The HOA had been escalating for months, sending letters, fines, and inspectors to try and make me bend. I'd ignored them because I knew they were bluffing, but a bluff only works until someone calls it, and they'd just called mine in the most public way possible. What they hadn't realized was that I had an ace in the hole, and it wasn't just the badge in my wallet. As we sat there, the fog beginning to lift from the yard, a set of sirens echoed faintly from down the road, getting closer. The HOA president turned to see 2 county sheriff's cruisers pulling up, lights flashing but sirens off now, moving slow like they were here for something official. I could feel the shift in the air. The security team was no longer the biggest presence on my property. The deputies stepped out, hands resting casually on their belts, and nodded to me before addressing the group. They'd been briefed on the situation, and their arrival was no accident. I had made sure of that the night before, when a friend in the county office tipped me off that the HOA was moving in on me. It was the kind of warning you don't ignore, and now it was paying off in full. The lead deputy asked to see the HOA's paperwork, which the president handed over with visible irritation. As he read, his eyebrows rose just enough for me to know the tide had turned. He asked her, in a tone that was halfway between curiosity and disbelief, whether she understood that her emergency notice had no enforceable legal authority on private, non-HOA land. She tried to argue, but he shut her down with one line. "Ma'am, this property is outside your jurisdiction. You and your security team need to leave." The look on her face was priceless. Part outrage, part disbelief, and part panic that the script she'd been working from had just been set on fire. The security guys shifted, waiting for a signal, but it never came. I stood, walked over to the president, and leaned in just enough for her to hear me when I said, "You've made this personal. That was your mistake." Then I stepped back, smiled for the deputies, and asked if they'd like a cup of coffee before they headed back down the mountain. The president glared, said nothing, and stalked back to her crossover while the SUVs backed out one by one. After the morning standoff faded into the stillness of the mountains, I knew the HOA president wasn't licking her wounds in defeat. She was pacing in her kitchen with a phone in her hand, already calling anyone who might give her a way back into the fight. I'd seen the look in her eyes as she drove away. It wasn't the look of someone beaten, it was the look of someone who had just decided to switch strategies. That was fine by me. I spent the rest of the day pretending to go about my usual routines, splitting firewood, checking the fence line, brewing another pot of coffee, but in truth, I was watching for the next move. It didn't take long. By late afternoon, my phone pinged with a notification from the county records site. The HOA had filed a series of urgent code compliance concerns that, in their minds, would force the county to intervene. I opened each one and almost laughed at the creativity they had employed. My mailbox was apparently a safety hazard due to sharp edges, my wood-burning stove was a fire risk requiring immediate removal, and my cabin porch was constructed in violation of visual harmony ordinances, which made no sense since my cabin was not even within HOA territory. It was like watching a desperate gambler throw their last chips on the table in the hope the dealer took pity. But I knew how this worked. These filings weren't about truth, they were about creating enough smoke to make someone believe there was a fire. That night, I sat at the old desk in my study and drafted my own paperwork. This wasn't my first rodeo dealing with overreaching authority, and I had learned that in battles like these, silence is a weapon, but so is overwhelming them with precision. I compiled copies of every deed, map, and jurisdictional boundary that proved my land was outside their control. I attached photographs of the so-called hazards, each one framed so obviously safe and compliant that anyone with common sense would roll their eyes. I even included receipts from certified contractors showing every improvement was up to state and county code. When I was done, I sent the whole packet, not to the HOA but to the county commissioner's office, the sheriff's department, and my attorney, with a note explaining the harassment campaign in progress. Then I poured myself a drink, leaned back in my chair, and waited. By morning, the waiting was over. I heard the crunch of gravel again, but this time it wasn't SUVs. A single tan sedan pulled into my driveway, and out stepped a man in a rumpled blazer carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as a county compliance officer, but the way his eyes darted toward the tree line told me he already knew this was a waste of his time. He explained, in a tone that made it clear he was reading from someone else's script, that he was here to follow up on multiple community safety concerns. I invited him inside, offered coffee, and laid out the same neatly organized evidence I had prepared the night before. Within 10 minutes, he was chuckling and shaking his head. "I'll be honest," he said, "I've never seen this much effort put into weaponizing bureaucracy." I asked him if it was going to stop, and he said something that stuck with me. "Not until they realize it's hurting them more than you." That was exactly the insight I needed. After he left, I drove into town, not to confront anyone, but to quietly set the next stage of my counter. I visited the little diner where half the local contractors and part-time deputies grabbed lunch, and I made sure my conversation with the owner was loud enough for the right ears to hear. I didn't accuse the HOA of anything specific. Instead, I casually mentioned how unusual it was to have county resources tied up over phantom violations, especially when those resources could be helping residents with real emergencies. By the time I left, I could feel the ripple effect starting. People here valued their privacy and their independence, and nothing irritated them more than outside meddling. Sure enough, that evening I received a call from a friend who worked part-time as a maintenance supervisor for one of the HOA's contracted facilities. He told me that the president had been fuming all day, complaining about obstruction and federal arrogance. More interestingly, he said she was planning an emergency HOA board meeting the next morning to address the escalating situation. This was the opening I had been waiting for. I knew that if I showed up, they'd try to use it as a trap, some staged confrontation they could twist into their favor. But if I stayed away, they'd spin my absence as guilt or fear. So I decided I would attend, but on my own terms. The next morning, I arrived early at the community hall where the meeting was set to take place. The building was an unremarkable structure with a wide porch and double glass doors, but today it had the charged atmosphere of a courtroom. Inside, the long table was already set with nameplates for the HOA board members, a stack of neatly printed agendas, and a microphone positioned for public comments. I took a seat in the back, deliberately far enough to look like an observer rather than a participant. When the president entered, flanked by two of the same security men from before, she spotted me instantly. Her smile was back, but now it was thinner, tighter, and I could tell she had spent the night rehearsing her lines. The meeting began with procedural nonsense, approving minutes, updating budgets, but soon the real agenda item appeared: special enforcement actions. The president launched into a speech about the importance of maintaining safety and order in the community, peppered with vague references to dangerous noncompliance that put residents at risk. Every few sentences, she glanced toward me, letting the implication hang in the air without naming me directly. It was a clever move. She wanted to plant the seed without giving me a clear target to refute. But she made a mistake when she invited those concerned to speak. I stood, walked to the microphone, and without raising my voice, laid out the facts: jurisdictional boundaries, property records, the county compliance officer's findings, and the growing cost to taxpayers of this personal crusade. The room shifted. People murmured. One board member started flipping through the agenda as if looking for a way to move on. I ended my statement by placing a copy of my documentation on the table in front of the president, then turned and walked back to my seat without waiting for her response. She tried to recover, talking about ongoing investigations and community trust, but the impact was already visible. I could see it in the way her own allies avoided eye contact with her. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about her leadership, and the cracks were starting to show. The mountain air was cooler that night, crisp enough to make the old wood of the cabin creak as it contracted, and I had just settled into the kind of quiet you only get up here when the nearest neighbor is a mile away and the world seems content to leave you alone. But quiet is a fragile thing, and it shattered with the faint, unmistakable sound of my back door latch being tested. I froze, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight spilling through the curtains, and listened. The latch clicked once, then again, and then a slow, careful push followed, as if whoever was outside was convinced they could ease it open without me noticing. I slipped from the chair without making a sound, moving through the living room on bare feet, and reached the shadow by the kitchen doorway just as the door eased inward. A man stepped inside, moving low and deliberate, a flashlight in one hand, a clipboard in the other. He wore khakis and a collared shirt with a patch that read Community Maintenance Division, which was laughable because there was no such division in this area. He paused to glance at the papers on his clipboard, then began scanning the shelves and counters like he was searching for something specific. I let him get 2 steps into the kitchen before I clicked on the overhead light. The sudden brightness hit him like a slap, and he spun around, eyes wide, stammering something about a routine safety check. I didn't bother hiding my disbelief. I told him calmly that if it was routine, he would have called, and if it was safety-related, he would have brought the county inspector I had already met. He tried to stand his ground, saying he had authorization from the HOA board, but his voice cracked halfway through, and I knew he was just a pawn. I walked him to the door, never raising my voice, never touching him, but making it clear he had 2 choices: leave now or leave with sheriff's deputies escorting him. He left without another word, disappearing into the darkness where a second man waited by a car parked just beyond the tree line. I stood there for a moment, watching the taillights wind down the dirt road, and my mind was already racing. They weren't just fishing for violations anymore. They were looking for something. The question was whether they thought I had it or they knew I did. Either way, they were getting reckless, and reckless meant they'd leave evidence. I locked the door, checked every window, and sat back down at the desk to think. The next morning, I drove down to the sheriff's office, not to file a formal report, yet, but to have a conversation. The same deputy who had been at my cabin during the standoff was on duty, and when I told him about the uninvited maintenance check, his expression tightened. He asked if I wanted to press charges, but I said not yet. If I acted too soon, they'd play the victim, and the HOA president was too good at spinning stories for her own side. Instead, I suggested we let them think they were still operating under my radar, while I quietly built a record. He agreed, and before I left, he handed me a small device no bigger than a pack of gum, a motion-triggered camera I could place anywhere. It recorded silently and stored footage internally, perfect for catching the next intruder without tipping them off. I spent that afternoon setting the trap. I placed one camera just above the back door, another inside the workshop near the tool racks, and a third in the living room where it could see anyone who made it past the kitchen. Then I staged the bait. On the desk in my study, I left an unlocked file folder labeled Project Ledger in big block letters, filled not with anything important but with a mixture of old invoices, random maps, and a few pages of fake correspondence that implied I was involved in some kind of ongoing investigation into property fraud. I made sure the dates and references were just believable enough to draw in anyone who thought they were stumbling onto something valuable. Then I waited. It took less than 48 hours. I was chopping wood behind the cabin when I heard the faint crunch of tires on gravel. I glanced toward the road and saw the same car from 2 nights ago, parked in the same shadowed spot. My cameras would be rolling by now, so I stayed where I was, splitting logs in a steady rhythm while I listened for the click of the back door. This time, the intruder didn't come alone. Through the trees, I caught sight of 2 figures moving toward the cabin, one of them carrying a small duffel bag. They slipped inside with the same careful movements as before, and I imagined them heading straight for the desk in my study. I finished splitting the log I was working on, then walked casually toward the cabin, making enough noise that they'd hear me coming and have to make a quick choice: stay and get caught or run. When I opened the front door, the living room was empty, but I could hear a faint rustling in the study. I stepped inside just in time to see one of them stuffing the fake project ledger into the duffel. I didn't stop him. I wanted them to take it. Without saying a word, I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, pretending not to notice them until they finally realized I was there. The one with the duffel mumbled something about document verification and hurried past me toward the back door, his partner trailing behind. When they were gone, I locked the doors and went straight to the cameras. The footage was gold, clear shots of both men's faces, the license plate of the car, and the moment they rifled through my desk. I transferred everything to a secure drive and made 3 copies, one for myself, one for my attorney, and one for the deputy who had lent me the cameras. By the time I drove into town to drop off the footage, I was already thinking about how to turn this into a bigger problem for the HOA than they could handle. If the president wanted to escalate, I would give her an escalation she couldn't spin her way out of. The deputy watched the footage without saying much, but when it ended, he let out a low whistle and said, "That's not maintenance, that's trespassing and theft." I agreed, but told him to hold off on making arrests until I gave the word. The longer they thought they'd gotten away with it, the more confident they'd get, and the more mistakes they'd make. He nodded, sliding the drive into an evidence envelope, and told me to call if I saw them again. 2 nights later, I saw them again, but not at my cabin. I was in town picking up supplies when I spotted the HOA president and both intruders sitting in a corner booth at the diner, deep in conversation over a spread of papers. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language was telling. The president leaning in, gesturing sharply, the others nodding and scribbling notes. It didn't take a genius to guess they were planning their next move. I decided to give them something new to chew on. On my way out, I made sure to pass close enough to their table that the president would see me. I didn't speak, didn't even glance at the men with her, just smiled, tipped my head in a polite nod, and walked out. I wanted her to wonder how much I knew, and more importantly, how I knew it. The call for the emergency town hall came just 3 days after I caught the intruders on camera, and it was delivered in the most theatrical way possible. A printed notice taped to my mailbox, an email marked urgent, and even a phone call from a blocked number that cut off after 2 rings. It was scheduled for 7 o'clock sharp in the community hall down in town, which meant the HOA president wanted maximum turnout and, more importantly, maximum attention. I could already guess the playbook. She would stand at the front of the room, painting herself as the vigilant defender of the neighborhood, while carefully implying that I was some sort of dangerous wild card living on the fringe. The trick was to avoid letting her dictate the narrative, and I knew I couldn't just show up and trade insults. If I was going to counter her, I needed to hit her where she was most vulnerable, credibility. So I spent the morning making a few calls to people who had quietly confided in me about their own run-ins with her overreach. By noon, I had 4 separate written statements, each describing an incident where the HOA had violated someone's rights or pushed beyond its legal reach. None of them mentioned me directly, which was perfect. It would look like a pattern of abuse, not a personal feud. When I arrived at the hall that evening, the parking lot was already packed. Inside, the chairs were arranged in tight rows, and the air hummed with that restless tension people get when they're anticipating drama. At the front, the president stood beside a projector screen with a slideshow already queued up, and I noticed she had placed 2 of her hired security men near the entrance like bouncers at a nightclub. She spotted me as I walked in and gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that says, "You're about to be outnumbered." I took a seat near the middle, where I could watch her and the crowd without being tucked away in the back. The meeting began with the usual procedural nonsense, approval of minutes, budget allocations, before the president smoothly shifted into her main topic, addressing threats to community safety. The first slide appeared on the screen, showing a blurry, zoomed-in photograph of my cabin taken from the road. She started describing an ongoing investigation into properties that posed a risk to neighborhood stability, using words like hazardous, unregulated, and potentially unlawful. Every few sentences, she glanced toward me without naming me, letting the implications seep into the room like slow poison. It was clever. She could stir suspicion without giving me a clear reason to accuse her of defamation. Then she made her mistake. She claimed the HOA had documented proof of ongoing illegal activities related to certain properties, and the next slide showed a photograph of my firewood stack alongside a caption about environmental noncompliance. I raised an eyebrow and sat back, because now she was on record, in front of a full house, making a claim she couldn't back up. I let her continue for another few minutes before I stood. The room quieted almost instantly, the kind of quiet that signals everyone knows something is about to happen. Without asking for permission, I walked to the front, took the microphone from the stand, and set a stack of papers on the table. I started with a calm statement: "I'm here to address the facts." Then I laid out the jurisdictional maps showing my property was not under HOA authority, followed by the county compliance officer's signed statement that every supposed violation was unfounded. I didn't raise my voice, didn't attack her personally, just dismantled each of her points one by one with evidence. And then I went further. I read excerpts from the written statements I had gathered, anonymizing the names but making it clear that these incidents involved the very same leadership now claiming to act in the community's best interest. The crowd started shifting in their seats, glancing at each other, and I could see the president's smile straining under the weight of her composure. When I finished, I placed the microphone back in its stand and turned to leave, but she couldn't resist responding. She accused me of misrepresenting the scope of the HOA's authority and undermining community trust. I didn't turn back, just said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "Community trust isn't undermined by facts, it's undermined by abuse of power." That landed harder than I expected. A few people even clapped, which seemed to throw her off her rhythm entirely. The rest of the meeting limped along with her, trying to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but the energy had shifted. People were now whispering to each other instead of nodding along with her points. By the time it adjourned, she had the look of someone who had just realized their control over the narrative was slipping through their fingers. I stepped outside into the cool night air, expecting to head straight to my truck, but found one of the security men from earlier leaning against the side of the building. He pushed off the wall and approached, keeping his voice low. "She's not going to let this go," he said, glancing toward the parking lot where the president was talking to a small group. "Whatever you think you've seen so far, it's nothing compared to what's coming." He didn't wait for me to respond, just walked past me and disappeared into the shadows. I wasn't sure if it was a warning or a threat, but it didn't matter. It was confirmation. The boardroom games were over. They were going to escalate, and they were going to do it in a way that broke rules. On the drive back up the mountain, I replayed the night in my head. I knew I had rattled her, but I also knew a cornered opponent could be dangerous. The smart move would be to tighten my defenses, shore up my allies, and be ready for the next strike. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had decided on a plan. I would keep pushing her to make public moves instead of backroom ones. The more visible her actions, the easier it would be to prove malice when the time came to take this to court. But before I could even put that plan into motion, the first sign of her counterattack arrived the very next day. A large envelope was waiting in my mailbox, stamped with "Official Notice of Seizure" in bold letters. Inside was a letter on HOA letterhead claiming the board had voted to seize my property temporarily, pending safety remediation. It was signed by the president and every board member, though I recognized two of the signatures as belonging to people who had privately told me they disagreed with her approach. That told me everything I needed to know. She was forcing compliance even from within her own ranks. I scanned the letter, sent copies to my attorney, and then placed it neatly in a folder labeled "Leverage." I wasn't going to fight this with outrage. I was going to fight it with strategy. I called the sheriff's office, explained the situation, and made sure they had a copy on file. Then I spent the afternoon walking the perimeter of my property, making notes of every possible point of access, every angle from which someone might try to stage a scene or